A task now. So this is paper 1. In the 2021 Leaving Cert, students are required to answer a question A or a question B. The paper I'm going to look at now is the 2013 paper, which was really a lovely paper. I have to say, the papers are always lovely. One of the things you have to do is make smart choices about the questions that you're going to answer, but the papers are really properly, thoughtfully put together and always give or offer the opportunity for the prepared student to answer questions which are reasonable and fair. So, as you know, in 2021, you don't have to answer A and B, as it says here. You do A or B. A lot of people struggle with the Bs. The Bs are, they're an interesting little task because they require this kind of marriage of creativity. You really have to be willing to engage in an imaginative way with a question B task, but also it really does require you to show a knowledge of genre. So we'll talk about Bs another day. I've done 1 or 2 videos, I think, on a B, but we'll do another one in the next couple of weeks. There's going to be 1 a day between now and the exam next week. But what we're doing here is we're looking at an A. So a student let me know that they were looking at this particular A and wanted me to have a talk about it, so I'm going to do it now. So this was an interview with William Trevor, the great Irish writer William Trevor, died a couple of years ago. If you ever want to read, wonderful fiction, read William Trevor, master of the short story, but also a novelist, and one of my favourite books, if you're interested. It's called The Story of Lucy Galt, written by William Trevor. So there he is. You had the passage, it was an interview, and then you have 3 questions. Now again, this year, we're not quite sure how the questions are going to break down. We know that this is not going to be the case this year, that this section will be worth 40 as opposed to 50 marks, because that is one of the changes they made to the exam as a reasonable accommodation given the circumstances this year. We do expect, though, that there will still be 3 questions, and we do expect that the 3 questions will be broken down into slightly different mark allocation. So what I expect is the first question will be worth 10 marks, the second question will be worth 15 marks, and the third question will be worth 15 marks, and that'll bring it to 40. Now, as I've said to you before, the rule has always been the same, and that is that you write 1 paragraph for every 5 marks available. So the first question, if you look here, asked you to outline 3 aspects of William Trevor's approach to story writing as revealed in the extract. Now, why did I ask for 3? Well, they asked for 3 because it's worth 15 marks. Okay, so that's the aim. Now, this year, if they ask for 2, I don't think they'll put a number on it, but if they write a question like that, my advice is, even if it's worth 10 marks, write the extra paragraph, the extra point. You have the time, and your competition is going to do that, and you have to be seen to be willing to work hard. Okay, so even though the amount of marks allocated for this section has been reduced, I would say almost ignore that and answer it as if those reductions haven't happened. The second question, so there's always an easy first question. This is very easy. You'll see it as we go through the passage now in a moment. Then there's a kind of a middling second question. Now, this one wasn't too bad, okay? William Trevor expresses strong views in his answer to the interviewer's final question. To what extent do you agree with what he has to say? But you see this one here. It says, to what extent do you agree? Now, that means that it's not just look in the passage and find the answer. That means that you have to think for yourself. Now, increasingly, over the years, those second questions in the A question, tend to require you to have an opinion. We've seen this as we've looked at A's from more recent exams where they've asked you to think about, a text that you've studied for your Leaving Cert on paper 2, which has a distinct atmosphere or sense of place, or a text in which a theme has been developed in an interesting way. So remember, the question 2s can be slightly tricky. Pay attention to it. Be careful think before you start writing your answer. I'll actually look at that one first because it was nice, I thought, because it just asked you to look at the final question or the answer to the final question. And then the third one, which is for most texts, most years, the style question. It says, do you agree that William Trevor's responses to the questions in the interview are rich in language and imagery? Now, when you see that, that's alarm bells, okay? So it should be alarm bells going off when you see rich in language and imagery. So what are you looking for? Well, we know they're asking you about aesthetic language. If they're talking about imagery, that's aesthetic language. Now, language can be rich in other ways as well. It can be rich. And what does rich mean? Well, rich in that sense means interesting. It can mean beautiful. It can mean substantial in the sense that there's hidden meanings. It can mean intelligent. There's a whole load of things. It's a personal response word. So you're looking for, aspects of his style that you can say, oh yeah, that's really, really, really impressive. So, things like an engaging opening, that's part of language. In terms of imagery, things like similes, metaphors, inventive noun, adjective and adverb combinations, maybe onomatopoeia, the appeal to different senses, the use of sibilance to create atmosphere or mood. So there are lots and lots and lots of things that you can do or look out for in a passage like that. Now again, here it's 4 paragraphs you're looking for, so 4 different examples. Okay, so let's have a quick look through the passage. Remember, read the questions first is my advice. Again, this year, time is not your enemy this year, time is your friend. We're expecting that you will have 3 passages again. You only have to pick 1 to answer. Read the questions first. If you feel the need to read the passage quickly, to scan it to make sure you're okay with it, this year you do have the time to do that. I think you should take, in an exam where you have 2 hours and 50 minutes or 170 minutes, I think you have up to 80 minutes to do your question A. Now, if you break that down into timing, you're going to take a couple of minutes to pick the text that you're doing and look at the questions. Then you're going to take maybe 10 or 15 minutes to read the passage really slowly, really carefully, marking the passage up as I'm going to show you now, making some notes on your rough work paper about the different points that you're going to make. So before you start the writing, you should be about 20 minutes into the process. Okay? So that leaves you somewhere around 50 to 60 minutes to write your answers. Now that is a lot of time. Okay? And if you break that down really, really simply, you're talking about taking somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes to write each answer. Now guys, that is really, you're going really slowly if you're taking 15 to 20 minutes. Again, my advice is take your time. Very rarely is a frantic, rushed answer of the same quality as a answer which is methodical and thoughtful and written slowly and carefully. Now, I understand that many of you like to have the flow. Once you get into the flow, you find it easier to write. And again, I understand that. But my advice and my experience is that the candidates who take their time to write answers in a careful, methodical way tend to write better answers. Okay? So let's have a look at this A. And we'll look at question 2 first. So it asked, to what extent do you agree with what he has to say in his answer to the final question? So let's have a look here. Now, this could have been tricky because it's worth 15 marks. And you're looking for 3 points. But all of the material that you're looking at is in this section here. So it says, do you think that literature has been much diminished by the glare of TV, cinema, video, and by entertainment hunger? That's a pretty big question. But when you look at the question, you can see why our question, this is the interviewer's question, and this is our question we're answering, was asked. Because if you look, you can see that it's asking about literature. So he's a writer, okay? And it's asking, has literature been diminished, which means reduced in importance, by A, the influence of TV? So let's have a look for what he says about that, and you can agree with that if you want to. That's one paragraph. B, cinema. That's another potential paragraph, unless you want to put cinema and TV together. Then C, video. That's another potential paragraph, unless you want to put them together. And then entertainment hunger, whatever that means. So you can see that there's plenty of possible paragraph topics there. So let's have a look at what Trevor said about that. I think there is a danger of that. So straight away, you're asking, do you agree that literature is diminished by the glare or the influence of these forms of media and entertainment hunger? So do you agree with that? In other words, are people more likely to be distracted by digital or visual media and therefore less likely to read books? That's what the question was asking. There's now the pressure of fashion in literature. And I imagine that is something that's demanded by your entertainment-hungry public. Fashion belongs in a coat hanger. In literature, in any art, it's destructive. Prizes and bestseller lists and fashion tend to tell people what to read, and it's discovering what to read for yourself that lends reading half its pleasure. So this is a crucial point he's making. It's discovering what to read for yourself that lends reading half its pleasure. So he really feels very strongly about that. He thinks that fashion is bad for literature. He says it belongs on a coat hanger. And what he means by that, and again, by the way, there's a lovely image you can use to answer question 3. What he means by that is people get caught up in, reading books maybe that happen to be popular in that moment of time. I remember a number of years ago, well, if you think about the Harry Potter craze is a good example, then a number of years ago in the kind of more grown-up, although, I haven't read them and I wouldn't bother me, behind reading them, but there was a fashion for reading these 50 Shades books. Then you have the idea that a book becomes really popular and because it's on the Booker Prize list and you should read it. So this is his opinion. Glamour and glossiness is not what literature is about, he says. Nowadays, books tend to be shoveled into a chat show wheelbarrow, more talked about than read. Now again, great example of imagery. But what does he mean when he says books tend to be shoveled into a chat show wheelbarrow, more talked about than read? So what he's saying there is that people go on, television, or they go on, podcasts, or they go on to, YouTube, and they talk about books, and people hear about these books, but they're not actually read. So do we agree with that? In other words, does the presence of TV, cinema, video, and entertainment hunger diminish the importance of literature? Now remember, the question is asking, to what extent do you agree? Now that means you don't have to agree with them at all, but it also means that you are allowed to come up with your own point of view. So you could say, okay, look, I agree that discovering what to read for yourself is what lends reading half its pleasure. I agree with that. And then you could tell a little anecdote maybe about, going to the library as a kid, or, your dad or your mum bringing you to, Hodges Figgis or some bookshop and letting you, explore the shelves, finding your own books. Maybe talk about social media today and how it's actually not a negative thing, because it allows you to, hear about books or about texts that maybe you never would have heard of. And when you have maybe people who you follow, friends on social media who share common interests, and they say they love a book, that opens up a page for you. So there's loads and loads and loads of things you can say there. Okay? And then you can bring in a point about something that he doesn't mention at all. Because the question is asking about TV, cinema, video, and he doesn't mention them really there at all. So you could bring in and say, I agree with what he's saying in part, I disagree in part, and I also think that he didn't mention the fact that, people are distracted by television, cinema, and video because sometimes it's easier to watch and stream stories than sit down and read books, and that does diminish the importance of them. So it was a tricky question, that one, and that was why it was a difficult passage. So one of the things you have to do as a clever candidate in this exam is pick a passage with the right question. So if you think about that, if you're looking at that going, bloody hell, Paul, that was a tough question. I don't know if I'd be able to do that. Well, maybe what you should do then is have a look at text 1 and say, is text 1 easier? And have a look at the question 2 there. Or have a look at text 3 and have a look at the question 2 there. And that's why it's so important to read all 3 sets of questions before you pick the text you're going to do. And again, in a normal year, that often is not done because of the fact that people are under such time pressure. In your year, this year, you have plenty of time. Okay? So that second question is no doubt was the more difficult of the 3 questions. The examiner is looking for you to really think for yourself, give your own opinion. Now, let's have a look at the first one. 3 aspects of his approach to story writing revealed in the above interview. And let's have a look at the third one, rich in language and imagery. So those were 2 very easy questions. So what I do here, I'm left-handed, as you know. So I have my piece of rough work paper to my left. And I know because I struggle with concentration. That's something that I've always struggled with. I know that I always make a note of the keywords in the question on my rough work paper before I begin. So I'm writing down approach to story writing, and then I'm writing down rich language and imagery. And I'm also writing down how many points I need for each one. You see this here? Like that. Okay? You can't see it, of course, you're looking at the screen. Sorry, I forgot I'm not that you can't see me. But write down the keywords on a piece of rough work paper to your left, to your right or to your left, depending on what side, what hand you hold a pen in, and have those words at the ready, written in big letters so that you don't lose your concentration as you go through, and how many points you need. So let's have a look. I'm looking for approach to story writing, rich and language and imagery. So let's read the passage. What is your definition of a short story? I think it is the art of the glimpse. Now, straight away, that's a great opening sentence. I could definitely use that to write a paragraph in terms of language and imagery because it's short, it's punchy, it's somewhat mysterious, it creates questions, it's visual because you get this idea of a glimpse, but it's not exactly clear what he means, and that's engaging. So if you're talking about rich in language, you can say that Trevor's opening line, his opening answer, is engaging. It is direct. It is interesting. It is thought-provoking, and is an indication of his command over language. If the novel is like an intricate Renaissance painting, that's a simile. Again, something you could talk about for question 3. The short story is the Impressionist painting. Now, those are allusions. Okay, an allusion is a reference to a bank of knowledge that should be shared between the reader and the writer. Now, we know that oftentimes we don't always understand allusions. We've read Van Bolen's poetry, and I know, for example, I didn't know the story of Ceres and Persephone, or as my children have pointed out to me, that those Ceres was the Roman and Persephone was the Greek. But anyway, that story. So I had to go and find out about that story. I didn't know the story of Aeneas and the Iliad, right? So I had to go and find out that story. So if you read him talking about the novel being like a Renaissance painting, but the short story be like the Impressionist painting, well, that's rich because that requires you to think. It requires you to do maybe a bit of research to understand what he's talking about. That's a good thing because it makes the writing more interesting and substantial. It should be an explosion of truth. Its strength lies in what it leaves out just as much as what it puts in, if not more. It is concerned with the total exclusion of meaninglessness. Look at this. Question 1. What about his approach to story writing? His approach to story writing is about the total exclusion of meaninglessness. He thinks the novel should imitate life. He thinks the short story is bony and cannot wander. It is essential art. All of that is relevant to question 1. Now, again, I think that's tricky enough to develop out. But you don't have to really explain that. You just talk about how he has strong feelings and how he explains it in colourful, interesting language. The second question asked, you've never created a hero. Why is that? He finds heroes dull. So that's something to do with his approach to story writing. Heroes don't belong in short stories. Again, very simple. As Frank O'Connor said, short stories are about little people. And I agree. I find the unheroic side of people much richer and more entertaining than black and white success. So the reference to Frank O'Connor enriches, who's a very successful and famous Irish short story writer, enriches his piece because he is referring to this very highly respected writer in order to support the point he's making. So that enriches his work. And of course, there's a whole paragraph there on his approach to story writing. If you find what he says up here very difficult to understand because it's quite abstract, this idea of the short story being bony and being about the exclusion of meaninglessness or being like an Impressionist painting. If you go, I wouldn't understand that. Well, you can certainly understand that he says, he does not include heroes in his text. There's your topic sentence. Then you give your quote, in which you say that I find them dull, and I find the unheroic side of people much richer and more entertaining. And then you explain how that influences his writing. Very, very easy for question 1. Then the next question, time plays a part in your stories. How important is the past? A huge amount of what I write about is internal, a drifting back into childhood based on a small event or a moment. So there's a second insight into his approach to storytelling. And the reason I'm able to have that in my head is because I've got the words written down to my left. The third thing that we see with his approach to storytelling is him saying that he writes about his childhood and he writes about small events or moments from his childhood. The separate point, separate paragraph. So if, again, you can ignore what he says up here if you find it too hard. So paragraph number 1 for question 1 is on his approach to heroes. Paragraph number 2 to question 1 is on the source material for his work, which is his childhood and small events or moments. Let's read further what he's saying. By isolating an encounter and then isolating an incident in the past, you try to build up an actual life. I think of a short story very much as a portrait. Time is like air. By the way, that's a gorgeous simile, relevant to question 3. And I think it's the second simile he's used in the piece. It is the second simile, so write a paragraph on his use of simile for question 4. Don't forget for question 3. So for question 3 now, we have a topic sentence, his use of simile enriches his work. We have a topic sentence, his use of, his reference to Frank O'Connor. Sorry, I'm just writing it down. enriches his work. And of course, we can talk about those allusions, but you might not want to make that point, but we'll stay away from them for the moment because there's loads more you can say. Time is like air. It is there always changing people and forming character. Memory also forms character. The way you remember things makes you who you are. People struggle to share a very private side of themselves with other people. It is that great difficulty that I often write about. So you can see this, what he's writing about, what he's talking about there is the inspiration for his novels. So his approach to story writing, he's not interested in heroes. He wants to exclude anything that doesn't have any meaning. He wants his work to be bony, and he wants his work to be direct and focused. His work is inspired by his childhood, by small incidents. He builds character from memory. He's interested in people who struggle to share a private side of themselves with other people. Those are the kinds of people he wants to write about. That's all relevant to his storytelling. The interviewer then asks, I've always wondered how you came to understand a character. And again, that's a paragraph topic. So how does he come to understand characters? It does seem to me that the only way you can get there is through observation. So for him, storytelling is all about observation. This is so easy. And what you observe is not quite like just meeting someone on a train, having a conversation and then going away. I mean, really, it's a kind of adding up of people you notice. I think there's something in writers of fiction that makes them notice things and store them away all the time. So what is he saying there? He pays attention to detail. When he meets people, he doesn't just, randomly meet them and then move on. When he meets people, he absorbs the details. Writers of fiction are collectors of useless information. That's his approach. He collects all sorts of information and then he uses it in his stories, relevant to question 1. A face comes back after years and years as though you've taken a photograph. That's another simile. So you can definitely write a paragraph on his use of simile, which gives colour and enriches the quality of his writing. It is as though you have for the moment thought. I know that person very well. You could argue that you have some extraordinary insight, but actually it's just a very hard-working imagination. It's almost, again, look, like a stress in you that goes on nibbling and nibbling, gnawing away at you in a very inquisitive way, wanting to know. Now that's another simile, but there you can talk about the choice of verb. Sorry. Okay, the repetition, nibbling, is lovely. The use of the word gnawing is lovely. Again, it's onomatopoeic. Nibbling and gnawing are onomatopoeic. The repetition of nibbling communicates that idea that once the thought gets into your head, it eats away at you and you can't let go of it, or it won't let go of you. And that's a good example of his use of language, which enriches the piece because it communicates how he writes. And of course, while all that's happening, you're stroking in the colours, putting a line here and a line there, creating something that moves further and further away from the original. The truth emerges. The person who was created is a different person altogether, a person in his or her own right. Now, isn't that just wonderful? There he is describing how you build characters. And he's saying you start off often based on real people. You collect information, and then as you write, it keeps eating away at you. You keep adding in bits and pieces of colour, little bits of imagination, and then you've got your character who might have originated based on a real person, but now is a different person in their own right. So you've got lots to say about his approach to story writing. You can talk about the bony, spare avoidance of meaninglessness. You can talk about his abhorrence of heroes. You can talk about the fact that he's inspired by his childhood and by people who struggle to share their private side. You can talk about where he gets his characters and how he develops his characters. There's 4 good points, and you've only got to make 3. Okay, let's keep going. You said that when you start a story, it often begins with a physical event, something you see or overhear which ignites something in you. So now we're talking about inspiration. Often it does occur like that, but the truth is that stories begin in all kinds of ways, with a remembered school teacher or someone who might later have had something to do with your life or some important occurrence. You begin to write in the process of writing, and in the process of writing, it is often the case that whatever it was that started you off gets lost. Now again, look at what he's saying. You're being asked about his approach to story writing, and you can see his inspiration comes from all kinds of sources. And he gives loads of examples, and those examples, let's count them, okay? So 1, 2, 3. Okay, oh sorry. How do I undo that? There we go, right? That's called a triadic structure. So he says it can come from all sorts of ways, but if he just says that and then moves on, then you're not really know what he means. But he gives 3 examples: a school teacher, who's somebody you might know well, another person who had some sort of influence on your life, or some occurrence that happened that didn't appear to be important at the time but turned out to be inspirational. So that's it. He gives 3 examples, and those 3 examples help us understand where his inspiration comes from, and that enriches the quality of writing, makes it more interesting. You begin to write, and in the process of writing, it is often the case that whatever it was that started you off gets lost. On other occasions, stories simply come out of nowhere. You never discover the source. I remember being on a train, and I was perhaps walking down to the bar when I noticed a woman and a boy travelling together. He was in his school uniform, and she was clearly in charge of him. I can remember now the fatigue on her face. Afterwards, probably years afterwards, I wrote a story called Going Home. Now, you see all that, folks, okay? See that? That's called an anecdote. And that anecdote, very, very beautifully written anecdote, describing the woman and the boy, and particularly her face with the fatigue on her face and him in his school uniform, that anecdote is interesting. It shows how random the inspiration can be for the writer. So the question asked about what do we learn about his style of writing, his approach to writing? Well, he could be inspired by a whole variety of things. That's a paragraph for that. The third question asked about his use of language and imagery. You've got his use of sibilance. You've got his use of references to other writers. You've got his use of onomatopoeia and interesting verb choices up here. You've got his use of triadic structure. You've got his use of anecdote. Lots and lots and lots of choices. Over here, you've got the allusion to fashion belonging in a coat hanger. Lovely image, okay? The choice of the verb choice, shoveled into a chat show wheelbarrow. Brilliant use of metaphor. And over here then, do you know how a story is going to end before you write it? I can see approximately, but only approximately. So again, that's another point you can make. Each paragraph provided you with a potential point that you could make about his approach to writing, and you only needed 3. And what he's saying here is that he has an idea of, before he begins to write, he has an idea of how he wants the story to end, but it's not a strict idea. He can play with it. With a novel, I can't even do that. A novel, and finally, look here, a novel is like a cathedral. Another simile. And you really can't carry it in your imagination the form a cathedral is going to take. I like the inkling, the shadow of a new short story. I like the whole business of establishing its point, for although a story needs not have a plot, it must have a point. So there you can see, when you go through a question A, there's lots and lots and lots of things that you look out for. You know that the first question is going to be easy, and you can see, even if you think you have a little bit of a panic at the start, I don't know what he's talking about, if you persist, you'll often find that each section or paragraph of the passage will provide you with a potential point, following your RIC rules, relevant topic sentence, followed by a quote or a piece of information from the passage, written as clearly as you can, and then contextualize or explain your point. So there are lots of options for number 1. You will have most likely a question on style. And don't forget, the styles are aesthetic language. This one was on aesthetic language. Narrative writing, storytelling, if it's a piece of prose or a short story extract or a novel extract that you get, or persuasive language or language of argument. If they mention information, just talk about detail and talk about how information helps substantiate or prove points in arguments, or helps fill out observations in personal pieces like this. This is essentially, it's an interview. It's a piece of personal writing in which he talks about his approach to writing. Okay, very, very, very straightforward. When you then sit down to write the answers, remember, you're trying to write a paragraph for every 5 marks available, but in the exam this year, maybe write an extra paragraph if the first one is only worth 10 marks, and write an extra paragraph if the third one is only worth 15 marks. Again, I don't know how they're going to lay that out, but remember that second question is often the tricky one, so pay attention to it and think about it before you begin to write.